Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 155. And this episode, we are talking about video game preservation. There has been an article that was put out a little while ago by the Video Game History Foundation that stated around 87% of video games that have been released since the beginning of video games are inaccessible to modern gamers or modern play or just the general gaming public. And there's a lot of ways that people can go about either preserving those classics, maintaining these things, and a lot of them have to do with things that we as individual proprietors of our own collections, of our own gaming experience, go for. And there's a very interesting moving line of what that all means. And to join us in that conversation of preservation of not just the games, but of the full context of that, from Vimm's Lair, which has been preserving the classics since 1997, Vimm, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Geoff. Thanks for having me.
We're so glad to have you. We were thinking about this topic and how massive it is. And when Geoff approached me about reaching out to you, I was very excited because I, like many folks on the internet, have been using your site for so long and it just grows and grows. You're constantly updating it. But I guess to start, before we get into the preservation of it all, how did you get started down this path of preservation and emulation? What inspired you to want to do this, since it is such a lofty goal and such an incredible site?
Well, it's kind of evolved over time. When I first started, it was just curiosity. I didn't know how to make a web page, and I had my internet provider offered a free website. So I figured, what the heck, I'll figure out how this works. And one day in class, I saw a kid playing Mario Brothers on a school computer. And I was like, hey, that looks neat. Maybe I should look into that. And that introduced me to the concept of emulation. And it was kind of neat, kind of fun. So I thought, hey, maybe I can build my site on this. And so that was how I picked the original topic for the site and looked around at other sites, found some things I liked, some things I didn't. And I picked the best parts that I liked and tried to combine them into what would be my favorite emulation site.
Makes sense.
That's incredible. And so as far as getting emulators and emulating games and all of that, you had zero experience with it when you started? You kind of were just learning from scratch?
Yeah, exactly. And it was a lot different 25 years ago.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, that's probably around the time, maybe a little before, I was definitely looking around me and seeing that this was a thing that could happen, and certainly playing NES games that I was having trouble making work on my old NES. That I still had my Nintendo Entertainment System in the late 90s, but the power button had gotten so unseated with time that the only way to make sure that the system stayed on was my brother and I made a little tiny paper airplane out of an index card to shove into the corner because the power button would pop out just enough to turn off. And having emulation was honestly a way to play games that I'd never found or just heard about, but also to get to revisit a lot of games that I loved.
Well, my original intent was nostalgia. I enjoyed playing old games that I remembered as a kid. And one moment that really brought it out for me was there was a kid down the street who, when I was little, we would play Nintendo games with.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't have any multiplayer games, so we would, just kind of take turns on a game. And since there really was no preservation at the time, the only way for me to really know if the game was what it said it was to actually play it and see if it looked okay. So I would go through the games, play it, snap a screenshot. And I got to one game that seemed very familiar. It was called Karnov.
Yes.
And I didn't recognize it at first, but as I started it up, it seemed strangely familiar. So I played it a little bit further. And it turns out I had played this game with my friend down the street when he was little. But in about sixth grade, his parents got divorced and I never saw him again.
That happens.
And we had played this game together so many times and never beaten it. So using the emulator, I played through it, and thanks to save states, I was finally able to beat this game that we had played together so many years ago. And that was just such an amazing experience that I wanted to share experiences like that with others to let them enjoy their own nostalgic experiences.
That's great. I mean, one of the things that we do on this channel is a show called Side Quests, where different hosts talk about games they love, and they are either popular games that it's ridiculous if you haven't heard of it, or games that this is the first most of us are hearing about it, but all of them have strong memories attached to them for the people talking about them. And a silly statistic that I want to give on this is there is a definite market for nostalgia that larger video game companies are giving us. There is the Nintendo Switch Online, which was begotten from the Wii Shop, the Wii U Shop, and everything else, the Virtual Console. And as of right now, as of June 5th, 2023, as I am looking at Wikipedia, and looking at the list, there are 95 games available, as well as all sorts of fun things that go along with that and special things. But going to the other Wikipedia page of the amount of Nintendo Entertainment System games that have been released in the US during the life cycle of the NES, there are 716 licensed games, which means that's 621 games that, including Karnov, that aren't going to see the light of day, or certainly aren't seeing the light of day right now on the Switch. And while Nintendo has a reputation for reckoning with its history, it is reckoning with the same corners of history. And thus we are left without those moments of, yeah, I could definitely off the top of my head, if I sit here, start listing off games for probably every system that I've ever played where they're never going to show up on the PlayStation Network as a PS1 classic. It's never going to be on the Nintendo Switch Online. But I think it's important that people have access to be able to play them.
Yeah. I think something that's interesting, you were talking about nostalgia and the feeling you got playing this game that you hadn't played since you were a kid. I think what drives a lot of video game preservation from what I see is just wanting people to have access to this stuff. I think one of the most frustrating things with the proper companies who should be re-releasing this stuff is like, yes, am I excited we're getting a Super Mario RPG remake? Absolutely. I love that game. But am I annoyed that the only way to play that game otherwise is through emulation or the mini SNES? Yes. Like, I think the fact that games aren't readily available everywhere, like a library makes books readily available, is kind of an inconsistency with media, right? You think about books, movies, you can get a lot of that stuff at a library or rental places, and video games just don't, especially now that things like Blockbuster are few and far between. It just seems less valid. Do you feel more onus or pressure or responsibility in these days when a lot of this stuff is just so inaccessible?
Well, there's groups now that are doing the heavy lifting for the physical preservation of the media themselves, but they're limited to recording the digital fingerprint, and the media itself is too risky for them to physically copy. And so the only way to literally preserve it is to make a full copy.
Right.
And speaking of the footprint of it all and the fingerprint of it all, it's easy to forget that the video game itself is not the only piece of the cultural significance or the context of the game itself. There's so many older games that I grew up in the age of the Nintendo Entertainment System, but there's so many NES games that I go back to where I am utterly befuddled as to what I'm supposed to do, because it was expected that you would get to read the manual when you played the game. And something that I absolutely love about your site and about the resources that you've made is the manual project, which is full color or as high definition as we can of scans of the manuals that came with these games to provide further context and a further resource. Can you tell us a little bit about how that started and where it's gone since its inception?
Well, when it started, I had just finished adding Nintendo games to the site and was looking for more that I could do with that to enhance the nostalgia. And I have a bunch of Nintendo manuals myself. So I thought, what if I scanned my own manuals and then have them up there alongside the game? Because, like you said, Nintendo games were very limited in their space, and often they needed the manual both to describe how to play the game and to just flesh out the game itself.
Oh, yeah.
Legend of Zelda is a famous example because without the manual, you're just left there wondering, what the heck do I do?
Every single one of those Legend of Zelda titles from NES onwards, if you've never looked at the manuals, you are missing out on, I feel like, 10% of the game, period.
Yeah. And buying the game and reading the manual on the way home was often a fun
Yep.
thing to do.
Yeah, it was.
So originally, manuals graphics were larger than the games themselves. So the original scans I made, over 20 years ago haven't really held up to the passage of time. They're rather low resolution by today's standards, but since then, I've made a point to scan for a higher resolution, so you can print them out if you want to, or you can just read them clearer, and hopefully that'll more future-proof them so that they're useful for longer.
Incredible.
When I was looking through the manual project, the first game I went to, because I remember reading this manual all the time, was Rocket Knight Adventures on the Sega Genesis, which is a game that I loved. And just the quality of the scan and then just seeing everything laid out page to page just took me back instantly. So there's clearly a care that you have for this. Were there any specific games that you played growing up that had manuals that you were like the first that you wanted to get in the system, ones that like really meant the most to you?
Legend of Zelda was definitely a big one
Yeah.
because not only does it tell you about the game, but it even tells you where to go, which in that game you have no clue where to go at the start. So
Absolutely.
very important for that game. But also the Dragon Warrior games.
Yeah.
I really like those, and those manuals were actually a full strategy guide.
Yeah, no, I'm reminded of a number of years ago, was gifted a complete in box copy of the original Final Fantasy for the NES. And I do take for granted how long it's been. And so most of the information about that game I've internalized. But that game was a 64-page manual plus all of the printouts and the full map and everything else. And so the Video Game History Foundation talking about inaccessibility to games, that is, yes, absolutely a thing that must be addressed and looked to. But the fact that there is a lot more to how we go about these games and how we play these games, and especially even in modern times when reviews happen about games and conveyance and everything else, this needs to be counted amongst them.
Yeah, completely. And like, it's funny looking at your site and looking at how long you've been doing this. I mean, you've caught up to Xbox 360 and PlayStation now. Those vaults are complete. Is it different now getting access to this stuff than it was back then? I have to imagine it's somewhat easier to either create the ROMs or at least get access to the ROMs than it was back then.
Yeah, I'd say it has gotten easier in many ways, often just because there's more communication. It's easier to talk to people. And I've found that there's a lot of private collectors out there who are making private preservation collections,
Mm-hmm.
and some of them are willing to share them. That makes things a whole lot easier rather than having to track them all down individually yourself.
Yeah, there is an interesting thing. I'm somebody who is a private collector of video games, who is very proud of the collection that I have amassed over the years and look forward to adding more to it. But this is something that is absolutely of utmost importance in my mind. Do you run into a lot of people that are more of a, no, I need to hoard this, this is mine, or is it generally an attitude of, yeah, I've got the physical thing and that's cool for me, but people should have access?
There's both kinds out there. There are hoarders who are more interested in trophies, but there's also others that are interested in simply the preservation or the nostalgia as well. I've also tried to leverage that enthusiasm by letting people upload the games themselves
Mm,
because new games are constantly being discovered or errors in the preservation are discovered and need to be fixed. And as one person, I can only do so much. So I try to leverage the collectors who are helping to find and fix those things, give them a place to share the current and the fixed copies, and try to make those private collections a little more public.
very cool. Very cool. I mean, there is something to your site where you make certain that you're not trying to put up anything of modern games. It is always, I believe it's 2 generations behind, is everything?
Right. Yeah. Anything newer than 2 generations, I have no interest in sharing that.
The difference between preservation and pirating, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a line. It's a gray line. It's not really defined anywhere, but I try to do my best not to cross that line.
Browsing the site, you have lots of different features. Per console, you have the month's top 10 downloads, the overall rating of like the top games based on scores, graphics, sound. I assume in the beginning it didn't have that, but you probably yourself were just curious, like the stats, like what are people most into? What games are people most excited about? Has there ever been a game that's like shot up a chart during a certain month because it was mentioned somewhere, or like you were surprised by seeing a certain game in a certain place?
I have seen times where people have intentionally gamed the system. Like somebody will do a podcast or a YouTube video about an obscure Genesis game, and then all of a sudden people just start upvoting it all over the place. Or vice versa, somebody will talk about a popular game and everyone will downvote it to try to tank it. But the system, it evens out over time. It's more just a fun thing to do. People have asked to be able to rate and review games, and that was something that was added by request.
Have there ever been requests that you've gotten from your community that you were surprised by? Like, oh yeah, I guess that does make sense. Or like, oh yeah, I should create that thing to give them this extra feature.
I'd say the very first one was being able to print manuals.
Mm.
Originally, I pictured people wanting to browse them online, see them in their web browser, but often people would want to print them, and they were too low quality to really print. That surprised me, and over time I had to adjust, make the quality higher, and give people a way to print them.
Makes sense. Do you ever find yourself either in communication and collaboration or whatever else? I mean, you have the manual project. There is also, listeners, the cover project. If you are trying to put together a full in-box sort of situation for yourself and you're not doing this for the value of it, but to have the full experience, one could print out high quality covers to most licensed video games that have been released. And through here, you have the manuals as well. Is there ever any sort of interesting either community crossover or anything that goes on there?
I haven't directly worked with them though, but it's a really neat project.
Agreed.
And I'd like to utilize that work to try to combine it. And if I can share their covers through Vimm's Lair, I think that'd be even better.
Now, a lot of what gets submitted, whether through the game files or the manuals or anything else, are community submitted. Yes?
Mostly, yeah. Historically, it was mostly my work, but it's time consuming.
Yes, it is. Very much so. Was there ever an interesting either breakpoint or tipping point or something where it seemed you were getting a lot more submissions from community because you do have your message boards and they are active, which is more than some individual websites can say. But was there points where you noticed the community was really stepping up more, whether a generation or a certain need was known?
Well, people have often made requests, and there's a lot of people out there eager to help. Giving them a way to help and automating it has been really helpful, I think, for everyone. Since pretty much the whole process is automated, whether there's a few people or a ton of people contributing, it all works the same. So the more people that want to contribute, the better for everyone.
And if anybody out there that's listening right now that has a private collection of some kind goes to your site and sees that, oh, I have some manuals that you need or anything like that. Is there anything in particular that they should know about preserving these things to submit them for part of the project?
Well, I think the hardest part is just figuring out how to make a good scan because it's a little harder than you might think. Getting the page flat on the scanner and all the pages lined up correctly without being crooked, it's not something you typically get perfectly on your first try. So just experimenting and finding a technique that works for you until you get a good looking result, I think would be the best advice I could give.
Yeah, because again, you are a solo operation. You can't be sitting there trying to rotate everybody's image files and to make it all work. It's got to come in good from them.
Right. And that is a feature I need to add. Right now, you can upload a manual, but if you make a mistake, you can't edit. And I definitely need to add that.
Maybe someone that's listening right now in the community can help build that. Fingers crossed.
Something I want to ask that actually I'm surprised we've gone this long without asking. The site is called Vimm's Lair. Where does the title come from?
Oh, well, let's see. That's been a while. The name Vimm is a misspelling of the word Vim, V-I-M. I wanted a descriptive name that would be unique, that other people haven't taken already, like so many names on the internet.
Sure.
And I came across Vimm of Vim and Vigor.
Yeah.
And I thought, hey, I know that, but it's not common. I'll try that out. But my internet provider required 4 letters. So I added another M to it, and it kind of stuck.
Of all the letters you could have added to that, I think M was the good choice there.
Mm-hmm. And as for Vimm's Lair, some of the early emulation sites I found, like Bowser's Keep was one that I took a lot of inspiration from. And I might have known about Zophar's domain as well. That was one of the early sites that I went to a lot. I just needed another word after Vimm to make it my own. And, Lair is like a home, like
Yeah.
a castle. So no real special meaning to it, but it kind of came together. And it can be hard to say quickly, but it works.
I think it flows well enough, and I love that. It also, much to the same thing of what we've been talking about here, it speaks to the context of the time. Matt and I were recently on a podcast talking about Metroid 2 and how there was the most infamous fan version of it, another Metroid 2 remake, which just seems ridiculous on its own. But when you look in the context of when it happened, that's what things were being called, and that's what they were. And here we are now. And so all of these things are touchstones of the context in which they were made and what they were and what they are. Now, one of the big reasons why emulation, certainly from where I'm sitting, makes a lot of sense or is as prevalent as it is, isn't just necessarily people don't want to play for expensive games, but on the preservation side of things, on older generations, not only is it that companies are holding on to licenses or nobody knows who owns the licenses for games, it's the fact that there is also a lot of legal gray area about digital libraries and being able to lend out games, which once again runs into the gray area of license holders and everything like that. I guess the question for me, and this is all of us talking here, this isn't just like an interviewing you, Vimm, but like all of us sitting here kind of talking about this, where is the tipping point? Where is the point where it starts being well, libraries have this, whether specialized libraries being able to allow access to games, because there again, they're digital files and libraries are able to send ebooks to your Amazon Kindle, and that's fine, and they can have limited amounts of that. And same goes for movies and other forms of media, but we don't have that for video games. And you know what? I'm going to switch up my question here. What does that ideal look like for all of us?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think what's interesting is like when you look at music or movies or even books, there are marketplaces that are kind of completely socially acceptable. You think about iTunes, like every album or song that you can think of from the past to now is pretty much on there. Whereas for video games, it's all still siloed by the specific companies, but record companies don't do that. Sony Music doesn't only put, like, it's everyone. I'm guessing iTunes is as popular as it is because it was common on the technology and became ubiquitous on that technology. But we don't really have that. Like the App Store for both Android and iPhone, you can find some classic games, but all of them are from those specific companies, and it's not as open as it is in other places. So I guess maybe we're waiting for Apple to create their own storefront for games, and then we can have every digital game imaginable. But like, I don't know that that'll ever fly in the same way. And I'm not quite sure why even. Like, I don't have a good answer for why we don't have that, but we clearly don't. Spotify kind of became the great equalizer. While artists don't get the money they should get for each stream, they get something. And almost everything is available there. We don't really have that for video games. All of those storefronts are locked to like the companies making them, and then you have folks like Sega who are just throwing everything everywhere because they're not a hardware provider anymore.
But yet again, they're still basically reprinting the same 60 or so games one way or another. If you want to play Sonic, you could play Sonic 1 and 2, and depending upon the music rights, you can play Sonic 3 and Knuckles. But can you play some of the more... Can you play Warlock? Can you play Dune? Probably not.
Yeah.
And that's why we're talking about this.
Ironically, one of the reasons that they can release games like Sonic 1 or Sonic 2 is because they are using an emulator.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
is true.
emulators could be the way to unlock these libraries. Because if I want to download Dragon Warrior for the Nintendo, I can't play it on my Nintendo. There's nowhere I can go to buy one. And even if I had one, it's probably broken and needs repairs. So just having the game isn't enough. You need something to play the game on. And frankly, emulators can be the answer to that if a company were to embrace it.
I agree. Frank Cifaldi, who is of the Video Game History Foundation, has had a series of fantastic talks about this at Game Developers Conference, GDC, over the years. And a lot of them very much talking about how emulation is, if not the sole solution, the backbone upon which the rest of game preservation is built upon. Because there again, you have companies like M2 that are very much about preserving through what is, in fact, emulation. The best way that you're going to be able to get these things out to people is through a software framework. Even a well-made one, an FPGA style, it's still going to be just that. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Matt, you were talking about Spotify. You're talking about iTunes. If you are at all an audiophile and want to call yourself that with a capital A and the snoot and everything, you would hate iTunes. You hate Spotify because of the mixing and mastering regulations about that, because of the fact that there's so much lost in all of this, and yet music endures.
Yeah.
If you want the physical experience of music, I collect vinyl, but I also listen to Spotify. Some songs, some albums, some artists I just want to listen to whenever, and other ones I want the full ritual experience of pulling the vinyl off the shelf, opening it up, pulling it out, setting it down, and I am going to be listening to Queen's A Night at the Opera while I make dinner because, damn it, I am not Roger Taylor and not in love with my car, but I will sing along with him while he does it on track 3. And I think video games can have the same thing. Comic books can have that. Books can have that. Physical games still have a resale market. And the companies that are holding the licenses aren't selling physical copies of the game. That is all just a market of people. Half the time, people are putting those into boxes that say 9.8. I'm selling this now for $300,000. But if you want to experience the game and you're not somebody that's going to notice the subtle differences of how many pixels off you're hitting the question mark block in Super Mario Bros. 3 to determine direction of where the mushroom's going, emulation is more than good enough. Nintendo Switch Online has been discussed in the past of being not the best form of emulation, but Matt, you and I, it's how we're going to play Earthbound.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's $350 before buying the Super Nintendo or something else. And this is all talking about legality and everything else. Emulation is the backbone upon which preservation must be built.
I also think if a company like Nintendo or Sega were to actually manufacture their old consoles, I think there'd be a market for an official NES or an official Genesis. I don't know what they'd have to sell it for to make money, but I'm sure people would buy it.
I agree. Yep. Look, Analog can sell their FPGA consoles for a very nice premium. They're HD capable and can play all of those things. Yeah, I fully agree. Nintendo, Sega, heck, they could do it bespoke, I don't know, or to order or something like that and charge us out the face. People will buy it. I prefer they didn't. But the market's there, you're right. And people are still making games. You look up any console, no matter how obscure, people are still making games for them. People are still making improvements for them. I, earlier tonight, was watching a video about an update to a mod to the 32X version of Doom. Because the same way that every single game is potentially somebody's favorite, every console, and people aren't going to let those things go. And if the main companies that hold the rights aren't going to sell them, people still want to relive those memories. And I don't think it's a criminal or bad or whatever thing to want to relive those memories. And that's why we have things like your website and many other things as well.
Companies like Limited Run and I Am 8-Bit do really well because there's clearly an appetite for this physical stuff. I mean, talking about analog before, I bought an Analog Pocket for a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is because we're getting a Game Boy Advance Shantae game on the Game Boy Advance in 2020, well, probably 2024, but like
in the 2020s.
We're actually getting the cartridge, and I want
20 years after the system was viable.
And I want to play that game on cartridge. And like, I have an SP. It's the front-lit one. It looks fine, but nothing's going to look as gorgeous as a high-quality system like this unless, could you imagine if Nintendo re-released the Game Boy, but gave it a front light or backlight, or, you know, re-released the Game Boy Advance with the backlight built in, like a lot of modders do now that you can buy custom from used video game shops. Like, they would print money. You're absolutely right. There's absolutely a market for it.
Especially if they released it in such a way where it was basically like Nintendo Switch Online. Like, it came preloaded with the same way that they've done the Game & Watch releases of Mario Brothers and Legend of Zelda. If you bought an Ambassador Game Boy that had 20 selected, curated Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games, but had a slot available for people to put in their old cartridges, yeah, you could sell that for affordable premium, is what I will call it.
Yeah. I mean, think about the Nintendo and SNES Mini, right? They sold really well. They sold out. They ran out of print, but you can't put your cartridges in them. If they had made them bigger, but with the same tech, which they absolutely could, making things bigger is not as hard as making them smaller.
Right.
People would have bought them and put their cartridges in. I have an in-box copy of Chrono Trigger with the manual. Over the moon to own that. I don't have a Super Nintendo, but if Nintendo released a Super Nintendo with a ton of preloaded games, but you could also put a cartridge in, I'd buy it day one because I have a cartridge to put in it. The hard part about getting into collecting now at this point in my life when I've sold off all my stuff is the consoles are so expensive. Even the N64, which is one of the more affordable ones, is still pretty expensive. I will always go back to emulation because at least then I have access to this stuff. You know, I am filling in some gaps or trying to make it as authentic as possible, putting NES and SNES on my analog pocket. It looks gorgeous. And now I'm carrying around a Super Nintendo in my pocket, which is amazing. But like, I miss playing that stuff on TV and I could get an adapter to put it on my TV. That's not the point, right? I think that what things like Vimm's Lair does for me is it lets me dive into my nostalgia. But of course, I think like anybody else would love to have some of that hardware physical stuff as well. And it's just not available. There are companies making things that do those things so you can get a physical something, but it's not these original companies. And I just don't understand how they don't see the writing on the wall and that people would buy this stuff.
Well, the NES Mini and Super Nintendo Mini were very popular, and it scratched the nostalgia itch for a lot of people. And a big request that I got was, how can I copy my games onto the NES Mini from Vimm's Lair?
Yeah.
And there are people who figured out how to do that. Unfortunately, the emulator on the Mini is very crude and had very low compatibility. But for the games that were compatible, people could copy them and play them on their NES or Super Nintendo Mini. And I think they'd be just as happy to play them on a real NES or Super Nintendo if somebody would just make it.
Absolutely, I agree. I, for a while, had an SNES Classic in my home, but I never played really the NES Classic. But from what I heard, yeah, the emulator on that was, let's not mince words, kind of crap.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, the PlayStation Classic only sold at all because a credit card opening up a door is more steps than it required to be able to start loading ROMs onto a PlayStation Classic. And there again, you're right, Vimm. That speaks to the desire that if you build it, there's a community now that will, even if it's, do you know what the word I was trying to get at before? Direct order. If Nintendo, if Sega, if Sony, if anybody who has bought up the rights to the Neo Geo or whatever, if they don't want to put it into stores, they don't want to deal with any of that, the direct market is extremely viable. It's why digital distribution works.
Yeah.
Because people go directly to the source as it is. And if you give people an even better source like that, I feel I'm being pessimistic here. 80% of people who download ROMs, pirate games, whatever you want to call it, are more than willing to pay a fair price for any of those games that they download. I'm certainly somebody that goes about and finding games for all manner of prices, all manner of things. The discovery of it's so much fun. But sometimes I got to emulate. Sometimes I need to get it digitally. But if you make it accessible to me, yeah, I'm going to do it. I would download Suikoden 2 and play it on an emulator if it weren't for the fact that the PlayStation Network sold it to me for $9.99 and sometimes on sale for $5.99. I think that's how I got it. And look, that's what got me to get a PlayStation TV and got me back into the PlayStation ecosystem. I had a PS2 and went, I don't know, I'm just buying retro. The TV came out and I went, oh my God. This was when the prices were completely rock bottom on it. It was $30. I'm like, if I get this, I could start buying PS1 classic games. I can get Tombo 1 and 2, Suikoden 1 and 2. I could get Vandal Hearts and so many other games that if I were to buy the physical copies would be immensely horrifying to buy. But I was able to buy it all there, if you buy the physical things, all of this. I don't have a conclusion here. I haven't had a lot of questions today. This is the discussion point, and this is just a frustrating thing, and I've been wanting to talk about it for a while.
I have a Super Nintendo of my own and the collection of games that I've had all these years, and it finally broke down and gave up a few years ago. And I'd like to have it back.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if I could ship that to Nintendo and have them repair it, or if I could buy a new one off the shelf, that'd be awesome.
And until around 2009, I think you would have been able to send in your Super Nintendo and they'd repair it for you.
Really?
There was, which I actually talked about this, I think, last episode or previous episode about, there was, actually even later than that, I think, they discontinued repair services for Famicom, Super Famicom, Game Boy, all of those and the US equivalents around the same time. And I think it was the late 2000s.
Wow, that's much later than I realized.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I felt like there was a while where I would look up and go, do you need your NES repaired? Nintendo will still do it. And there were just incredulous articles about that. And maybe even that, not even make more of them, but allow for the repair and the preservation. Yeah, no, I hold on to backup systems as they come into my life because, yeah, that's going to happen to me. There is physical decay. And so it's not just a matter of getting what you didn't pay for. It's holding on to these memories and holding on to these artifacts and pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's about accessibility above all. Like, yes, did I load a bunch of games onto an SD card from my Analog Pocket that are readily available on the Switch Online that I'm already paying for? Sure. But, like, I'm already paying for it, so who cares? But just the same, like, when they re-released Metroid Prime, people went nuts for it. And they're like, oh, I can't believe people want to buy this Metroid game. Like, how are you unaware that one of the most popular franchises ever made, I think Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime both outsold any previous Metroid game that's ever existed because they're not accessible. They are now because they've kind of rolled them all out, except for Zero Mission, which I am patiently waiting for. But, like, I think to me it's so frustrating also the negative hearsay around emulation. And you're right, Vimm, when you said earlier, it is a gray line, right? Like people who were emulating Metroid Dread to run it at 60 frames per second, you're taking money out of the hands of folks who are working on a game that is out now, being sold now. But nobody's making money off of Super Mario Brothers. Not a single person.
Who's making money off of 8 Eyes for the NES?
Right. It's like these games don't exist anywhere else. And again, if you could pay $50 to get every single game in the Nintendo library, plenty of folks would. But because you can't, we have to emulate them. We need sites like yours to get access to this stuff. You know, if I want to share with my much younger friends of mine classic NES games that they've never heard of, because there are a lot of bizarre ones. Like every time I mention Mendel Palace, everyone's like, what? What's that? You mean one of the first games that Pokemon Game Freak ever made, Mendel Palace, that game. And they look at me sideways. And so I have to then boot up this game that kind of makes no sense, but I still love anyway. And I just feel like there's no easy avenue for it. And so it just becomes this kind of frustrating thing. All of this ranting does lead to a question. Vimm, was there ever a game that like was your white whale for a long time that like you couldn't find a copy of this game, you knew it existed and you really wanted it as part of Vimm's Lair and you were actually able to finally find it?
I can't say that one comes to mind, but there was an early game that I really wanted to play and wasn't able to. When I first discovered emulation, another factor of it is there's community translations for games that have never released in the US.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
And when I learned that there were Final Fantasy games that never came to America, I wanted to play them.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah.
Final Fantasy V was one of the early translations, one of the early quality translations. And I really wanted to get my hands on that and play through Final Fantasy V. And I actually have a Super Magic card, which is a Super Nintendo copier.
Mhm.
And so with that, I was able to load the fan translation of Final Fantasy V and play it on a real Super Nintendo on a real TV. And that was really neat. And I know it's kind of a different kind of nostalgia,
Sure.
but it's only possible because of the enthusiasm and talents of fan translations and their contributions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, the most famous and infamous one that even Reggie himself cracks jokes about it on the internet now, but Mother 3 has an incredible fan translation, but like Nintendo still won't release it here. And it's like the ironic thing about that one is like they translated Earthbound Beginnings, Mother 1, to release it on Nintendo Switch Online, but they still won't release the actual most recent one. And it's just like that kind of backwards logic is mind-boggling. But yeah, absolutely. Like one of my projects this year is to get through Earthbound so then I can play the fan translation of Mother 3 on my analog pocket, almost as intended. Close, It's on an EverDrive, on a Game Boy Advance EverDrive in the cartridge slot. It's as close as I'm going to get, right?
We're doing our best.
Right.
We're not reading Shakespeare in the original Klingon here, but we're doing our best.
Yeah. I think that at the end of the day, emulation is important because you can look at it very simply as piracy, but I think that's oversimplification. I think the reality is these games that don't exist anywhere else, it can't be piracy if you can't purchase them, right?
I agree.
Look, if you're pirating indie games that are out now that just came out, that's a different story. These are small devs who could use that money to make more games. But it's the anti-capitalist stance also, right? I do not feel bad about taking money out of Nintendo's hands. They're going to be just fine if I pirate a copy of Super Metroid. Come and get me, Bowser. Throw me in jail. But I'm going to be less worried about that than for example, a game like Sea of Stars, which I've been obsessed with, which is a very retro style RPG. We got review codes for it, and I'm probably still going to buy a copy of it because I want to support the studio because I know every dollar helps a studio like that. It's just, it's apples and oranges.
And to the point of the importance of preservation, a very well-known indie sort of throwback RPG is Undertale, which has its roots in Earthbound, absolutely, but also has been compared to, I don't recall if Toby Fox ever spoke about this, but has been compared a lot to Moon, a remix RPG that was originally on the PS1 that I believe was a Japan-only game that was a little obscure and a little hard to get a hold of. I think it was only on the PlayStation Network Japanese store. Makes sense. But it was also recently released by Limited Run Games, and my copy came in not that long ago. I'm super excited to play this, and I feel that's important because a lot of game design these days is built on our memories and built on I loved this game as a child. I loved this experience when I had it, but wouldn't it be great if, or let me build on the nostalgia of those memories and make something incredible. And so I think really what this comes down to is a little bit of playing ball from the larger companies, but we've already got the answer here. It's community. It's people making fan translations. It's folks maintaining vaults and projects to keep these things alive. It's circulating the tapes. It's always circulating the tapes. The BBC is getting old episodes of Doctor Who from people who taped them, not from their own archives. And I think those sorts of things should be acknowledged and lauded and applauded. Because, like you said, Matt, if it's a new thing, different conversation. But just because it's talking about the same things in macro doesn't mean they're the same thing. So we didn't start this episode thinking we were going to solve game preservation, but damn it, we wanted to keep the conversation going because that's what we're here to do.
Yeah. Vimm, thank you for joining us. This has been wonderful. If people want to get in touch with you, reach out to you about Vimm's Lair and have questions or talk about emulation, what are the best places to reach you?
Well, the Vimm's Lair message boards are the best place. I'm always reading them, even if I'm not always answering.
So we talk about you're always trying to stay 2 console generations back. So are you current as of now with every console up to 2 generations back?
With the popular ones, yes.
Yes.
The Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. But the next step is to expand to the lesser known ones. All the Sega consoles, Atari, and those other failed consoles, they all have their own following too, and their little special place in people's childhood. And it'd be nice to make them accessible too.
Well, you're doing incredible work, and we're grateful to have had this conversation with you. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us. And everyone, if you are looking for a history of video games in one cool place, Vimm's Lair is definitely a good place. Just go to vimm.net, and there's tons of stuff to look at. I recommend going to the manual project and just looking for your favorite game from your childhood. The nostalgia is pretty sweet and pretty good when you get to do that.
And if you think you're not going to get lost doing it, you're going to get lost doing it. I had things to do that day, but it's fine. It was wonderful. But What are your thoughts, listeners, on game preservation? What are your favorite games that you've never seen on any collection or officially supported in any way? What were the games that you discovered through game preservation efforts, whether through fan translations of games you never knew existed and then became favorites, or games that people told you about and the only way to get them was, well, emulation or something of that ilk? We want to know about that. We want to hear about that. And there's so many great ways to get in touch with us to let us know. You can find us across any social media we're on, which is at the moment, as of this recording, X, Instagram, and Tumblr, Fun and Games Pod. You can also email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Please let us know what you thought of this episode, previous episodes, who you'd like us to talk with, and what you'd like us to talk about in future episodes. You can also stay up to date with a lot of what we're doing through our Patreon. We release all of our content there, like these episodes, for free, plenty of things that we're working on. And we also do have some additional things we work on for some of our extra stage patrons. But you can go to patreon.com/funandgamespod. If you have the means and desire to support us financially, we super appreciate that. And we'd like to shout out those that are on the high scoreboard today: Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Roger Reichart, Alejandro Alves, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Rob Tremarco, Robert Proyne, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much for your support. Please enter your initials. Also delete them after 24 hours, otherwise it's a crime and we're going to be knocking down your door. But you can also go to certainpov.com and find not only a permanent invite link to our Discord server where we continue so many of these conversations, but also links to so many other fantastic Certain POV podcasts.
You also can follow us on 2 new social media platforms. We are on Blue Sky and on TikTok at Fun and Games Pod. You're welcome. The TikTok we're going to experiment with. If you want to see videos of Geoff's video game library, if you want to see me lip syncing to strange quotes from obscure video games, couldn't go to a better place than Fun and Games Pod on TikTok. Or we'll just leave it dormant for months because we're overwhelmed and don't have any ideas. Who knows? It's the magic of the internet.
Life's funny like that.
Life is funny like that. And of course, if you have a moment, please rate us and review us on your podcast platform of choice, especially Spotify or Apple, as it is the easiest places to do it. Spotify, you just got to listen for 30 seconds. You can even fast forward, and then you can hit us with that 5-star, because I like to think we're a 5-star podcast, and we really appreciate it. You can also reach out to us at funandgamespod@gmail.com, like Geoff said. If you have guest suggestions, want to connect us with folks, or reach out about a side quest, you don't just have to reach out to us on social media. You can shoot us an email if you have an idea for a game you want to do side quest for, and if it's available, we'll hit you up. And if it's not available, we'll send you the list so you can find a different game. But we would love to have you.
Absolutely. And we do read the reviews that people put up. I don't think I ever shouted out Pisces Jest for your very nice review that you put up on Apple Podcast about us. Thank you very much. And yeah, absolutely reach out to us about side quest episodes or games you want to talk about, because this is how we find out about these things, by speaking with each other. All of this that we talk about, all these conversations we have, all of these topics, we couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am at AK Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Do you feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too, until now.
Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
and Jacob McCord.
With many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. All with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Crossplay Conversations debuts on August 1st with brand new episodes hitting every other Tuesday. Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers
and happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.